Uh, Lesson 102. We kind of skipped a couple lessons in there because we somewhat probably covered them in other texts and things, and also in sermons. And so, uh, lesson 102 uh, deals mainly with Matthew, the 25th chapter, verse 31, and through the rest of the book, or through the rest of the chapter there. And then we get into chapter 26. But we've come to a very sad day in the camp of our Lord. We are finally, what day have we been in? Tuesday for weeks now. Well, we're finishing up Tuesday tonight, and we're going to finally move from Tuesday to Wednesday. Now, it's interesting that not much happened on Wednesday or Thursday according to the Gospels. In fact, they call this the calm before the storm. Now, over these next 3 class sessions we have today, Sunday, and a week from today, we're going to cover really a wide range of topics. One of the things I want us to look at before we kind of get into it is we need to finish Jesus' teaching concerning the destruction of Jerusalem and his second coming, still in, again, Tuesday night, and then lead into the events on Wednesday. You probably remember that the apostles had retired to the Mount of Olives on Tuesday evening, and Jesus continues his discourse, if you will, in chapter 25. He tells 3 parables concerning the end of time. A parable of the wise and the foolish virgins, the parable of the talents, and the one that has been often called a scene of judgment in 31 through 46. There's one theme, I guess, that we could apply here to the last 2 illustrations at the end of chapter 24, parable of the 10 virgins and the parable of the talents, and actually to the first 2 chapters of verse 20 of chapter 25. And that theme would be what? Overall, we talked about it actually during the youth rally, that we need to always be what? Ready. Always be prepared. Notice some key verses in Matthew 24, going back a little bit. 36, verse 36 of Matthew 24. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. In 24 again, look at 42. What does Jesus say? Watch, therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. And then 44 again, therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour when you do not expect him. In the first 13 verses of Matthew 25, we see the parable, the story of the 10 virgins. Now, according to Jewish custom, young virgins were always used as bridesmaids. And we remember the story, I know very well, that there were 10 bridesmaids, 10 virgins waiting for the bridegroom. And one of the things that they needed to do was be prepared, right? And 5 of them were called foolish because why? They weren't prepared. They didn't bring enough oil for their lanterns. And 5 planned properly and brought enough, even extra. It's interesting, and I didn't know this till studying this a little bit, that the bridegroom of that culture liked to keep the time of their arrival secret. I guess they didn't want what a lot of people do today, shenanigans of any kind, hoodwinking the bridegroom and scooping him off someplace. Their weddings were traditionally at night. And since this was at midnight, and we know that from verse 6 where it says, and at midnight a cry was heard, it was understandable that all 10 of the virgins had grown weary and fallen asleep. Now, was there anything wrong with that? No, not a bit. Jesus did not condemn them for sleeping. When the cry went out that the bridegroom was coming, all 10 got up and trimmed their lamps. But the foolish ones, as we said before, didn't have enough oil, and they did not plan well. They asked for help from the other five, but they did not want to give up what they had planned for and prepared just in case. And that's not wrong. It's not wrong. Question: how do you plan for the unknown? It's kind of a deep question. How do you plan for the unknown? Anything, the unknown. Right. Yeah. Anticipate. Okay. Uh, prepare. Right. Right. And that's all part of it. But James, you had a hand up. I think that's where I'm going with this is that you need to set a target or a goal, no matter what, and you determine what that goal is. You know, everybody's goal in this room ought to be to get to heaven, and no matter what happens in life, that's not going to cause you to veer off course. Now, it happens sometimes, and when that happens, you need to develop a path forward. How am I going to get there? Um, And the third thing I have down here is develop agility for crisis management. I had a CO one time he had a saying. He says, "Never make a decision when you're running uphill." And I have remembered that forever. You never want to make decisions when you're in crisis management and not thinking clearly. And when you're running uphill, that's hard, harder than running flat. So I always remember that. Never make a decision when you're running uphill. Is there any additional comments? I see some strange faces. Expect the unexpected. Yeah. And when I talk about planning for the unknown, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but I'm going to live my life that, I hope to be around tomorrow. I'm going to plan for tomorrow. There's nothing wrong with planning as long as you're ready today, if that makes sense. Yes. Yes. That's exactly right. That's right. I mean, like the old TV show, we can call a friend, help. We can rely on each other. But that's all part of, I think, developing that goal, that plan, that path forward, and being able to say, okay, yes, oh yeah, yeah. You don't see very many hearses going down the road with a U-Haul behind them. I mean, you just don't. Yes, right. But you're prepared in case something does happen. That's right. We always try to carry extra water, maybe some MREs. Those be tasting pretty good, if you're hungry. Yes. Yeah, yeah. No, I think I just, proper planning, as the old saying goes, prevents poor performance. And so if you plan ahead, Plan for the unexpected, and hopefully that never happens. That's the only thing I was trying to get at. I probably left a lot of you confused. Didn't mean to. Yeah. I guess a better word may have been unexpected instead of unknown. I buy that. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments on that? Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. All right. So, and then moving on in the parable of the talents, the wealthy householder was going away, right? Was giving responsibilities for his possessions to his slaves, who were expected to exercise wise and faithful stewardship. And we know this story very well also. One he gave 5 talents to, one he gave 2 talents to, and one he gave 1. Uh, I learned this also. The talent was originally a measure of weight, approximately 350 pounds, in fact. So a talent of gold would be worth a lot more than a talent of silver. And the parable does not say which one it was, but nevertheless, either one would have been a sizable amount of money entrusted to each slave. Even the 1 talent, even the one. And we know from the story that the man with 5 talents went out immediately, and some of your translations say that, or some say at once, and they traded, they invested, and he made double. He got 10 back. The one who had 2 likewise did the same, and he doubled his amount to 4. And of course, we know that the 1 talent man, with his, look at verse 18, what it says in Matthew 25. But he who had received 1 went out and dug it in the ground and hid his Lord's money. Why did he do that? He was what? The lazy? Okay, yeah. That's pointed out. That's what the Lord called him. Yes, Justin? He was afraid. Absolutely. That's part of it. Any other thoughts? Well, yes. If you read verse 24, it says, Then he who had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. See, the slave had no faith in his master's fairness and goodness, even though his master had placed enough faith in him to give him that 1 talent. It's not that he didn't trust him with more, but he gave him what he knew or felt that he could handle. Um, the other thing was, another reason I think is he had no confidence in himself or his own abilities. And then the third, as he said in verse 25, he says, Look, and I was afraid, just like Dustin said, and went out and hid your talent in the ground. Look, there you have what is yours. See, it's interesting that some people are fearful of doing wrong, are so fearful of doing wrong, that they never do what is right. You know, more people will be lost because of failure to act positively than will be lost because of negative action. I think that's sad, Wayne. Yeah, yeah. A lot, a lot, for sure. I mean, the one with the 5 that returned 10, and the one with 2 that returned 4. What did the Lord say? Well done, thou good and faithful servant. You know, if the 1 talent guy had just invested it in the bank and made interest, he would have heard those same words. But he didn't. He was wicked and slothful, as it says, lazy. Lazy. I can't. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and as you see there in verse 26 that I just mentioned, Jesus said, "You wicked and lazy servant." Again, even if he just put his money in the bank, he would have heard those words, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." Instead, look at verse 30. This is what they did with him. "And cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Any thoughts or comments on the kind of quick review of the talents and of the 10 virgins, part of chapter 25? Okay. Um, Jesus' discourse or his teaching on this Tuesday evening closes with a graphic portrayal of his return. Now, some teach that Christ will return to set up a physical political kingdom and that he will reign on earth for 1,000 years. Jesus, however, indicated that his return will be immediately followed by what? The judgment. The judgment. Some teach that there will be multiple judgments and refer to Matthew 25, what we're going to study next here, 31 through 46, as the judgment of nations. But the Hebrew writer in chapter 9 of 20 and verse 27 makes it very clear that there will only be one judgment day. It's interesting, in my Bible that has little subcategories and headings, and 431 through 46, it says, judgment of the Gentiles. Anybody else have that in their my New King James Version? Verse, well, it's not a verse, it's just a subtitle. Judgment of the Gentiles. And that's not right. It's the judgment of all nations will be gathered before him, as it says. ESV, the one I have at home, says in that little subcategory, final judgment. And that's fitting. And verse 32 clearly states all nations will be gathered before him. Excuse me. There will be only one judgment. And all people, whoever lived, will be present. That judgment will involve a separation. Okay, that's what we're going to talk about. In the judgment, the Lord will divide men as shepherds of Jesus' day divided the sheep from the goats. The righteous are who? The sheep, right? Sheep will be on which hand? The right hand. And the unrighteous, or the goats, will be on the left hand. Just like in the parable of the talents, we learn the importance of serving the master faithfully. And this passage gives example of one way we can serve. And as you see there, and we're going to read a little bit, by assisting others, the unfortunate, helping the hungry, the homeless, the naked. And the way that word naked is used throughout the Bible doesn't necessarily mean no clothes at all, but insufficient clothing. Okay? Not enough, for example, during cold weather. Things of that nature. And he goes on, the sick and the imprisoned. You know, an interesting point here is that the sole basis for judgment in this story, okay, 31 through 46, the sole basis for judgment of this illustration or parable, if you want to call that, is not, you shall not, okay, it's like what it says, you shall not lie, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, etc. But this is you shall command. Okay? Remember what James wrote about pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is what? The visiting of orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Here, Jesus included good works in the judgment decisions. It's interesting. The emphasis is on helping fellow disciples, but the application can be made to all people. Remember what Paul wrote in Galatians 6:10? Therefore, as we have opportunity, what do? Do good to all, but especially who? Household of faith. Absolutely. The household of faith. It's interesting that some people delight, they take great satisfaction in pointing out that the basis of judgment in Matthew 25 is not how sound we are teaching, but how loving we are in our actions. Okay? And here again, we must be cautious and point those scriptures that show the essentiality of being right in doctrine and in life. Okay? At the same time. Okay? We can't put the others ahead or behind. It goes together. Okay? Any thoughts or comments or questions so far? Yeah. Yeah. From a humanistic point of view, a lot of people think that. You know, a lot of people think that. A lot of people think just as you and I, as fathers, it hurts us to discipline our children. So how could we possibly, uh, we're children of God, be sent to hell for all of eternity? But believe me, we will if we're not obedient. Some people will say that the basis of judgment is not belief in Jesus, but whether or not we do good works. Because faith in Christ is not mentioned here in this uh, chapters and verses 31 through 46. It's not there. And also, though, at the same time, these verses do drive home the point that being morally pure and doctrinally correct is not enough. Okay? We need that. Don't get me wrong. We got to have that. But we need to do other things. We need to have our works. Any thoughts or questions? Yep. That's right. That's right. And I got that written down. You read my notes ahead of time. But yeah, James, uh, well, look what Roper wrote if you have your books with you. On page 375, about the middle, next to the last paragraph, it says, for the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God who he has not seen. And that therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. Him it is sin. Our, our religion, if you will, must demonstrate itself in helping others. In helping others. And here's a very important point to not ever forget. Do not miss the point that when you help or mistreat a brother, you are helping or mistreating Jesus. Matthew 25 and 40 and 45 says that. 40, and the king will answer and say to them, surely I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, or your Bible might say brothers, you did it to me. And 45 is the same thing. Then he will answer them saying, as surely I say to you, inasmuch as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. Yes, Wayne. Yes. Exactly. Exactly. Going back to that, how how we treat others is how we treat Jesus. Remember Saul on the road to Damascus, and the lights came down, and the voice said, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Okay, he was mistreating others, and because of that, he was mistreating Jesus. I think that's pretty important there. Yeah, and hit the accelerator. Yeah, we are to be transformed, like you said. Yes, good point. In the comments. Okay, as we conclude this portion of our lesson and bring to close this long and very eventful Tuesday, question that's simple to ask of us is how important is it to be ready for Christ's return? It's absolutely essential to be prepared. Um, we know that the unprepared will go away into eternal punishment, says that in verse 46. And these will go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Although we made it to Wednesday, okay, remember in the Jewish thinking, when does Wednesday happen? After sundown on Tuesday, right? Okay. So, although we made it to Wednesday, Tuesday afternoon sundown, as indicated by the title of the lesson, the calm before the storm, other than the brief statement made by Christ in verse 2 of Matthew 26, let's look at those first two verses of, and this is the religious leaders' plot to kill Jesus. Now it came to pass when Jesus had finished all these things, and it's all these things that we just talked about, the separation of the goats and the sheep and the talents and the 10 virgins. Um, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." Other than this brief statement made by Christ in verse 2 of Matthew, we have no record of how he spent most of Wednesday or the first part of Thursday. John 13 and 1, let me turn over to that. John 13 and 1 gives us some insight into the Lord's frame of mind during the hours preceding Friday. It says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." Loved them to the end. What a example to all of us that is. In his darkest hour, if you will, he never stopped loving everyone. Everyone. Um, and we see here for the fourth time, Jesus informed his apostles of his impending death. Christ may have rested, okay, um, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but his enemies certainly didn't. No. On that Wednesday, the Sanhedrin met in secret session in the courtyard of the palace of Caiaphas, the high priest. Council members that were partial to Jesus, remember, such as Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, may not have been called to this meeting. They may have been purposely left out. And the plan to kill Jesus did not originate at this time, because they had been planning this for a long time, all the way back for a number of times. It had been determined long before this that they had to kill Jesus. And what was decided at this meeting was how this would be accomplished. It's interesting that the Jewish leaders knew that they could not take him publicly without causing what? A riot among the people. Yeah, look at 3 accounts here in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew 26, 3 through 5. Then the chief priest and the elders of the people were gathered together in the court of the high priest named Caiaphas, and they plotted together to seize Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they were saying, not during the festival, otherwise a riot may occur among the people. Mark 14, 1 and 2 pretty much say the same thing. And then in Luke 21 and 22 and 1 and 2, it says, now the feast of the unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was approaching. The chief priests and the scribes were seeking how they might put him to death, for they were afraid of the people. They were afraid of the people. Any thoughts or comments on that portion? Now, that takes us basically the first 5 verses in chapter 26. Again, verse 5, they end up saying, but not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. Then in verse 6 of Matthew through 13, we see Mary anoints Jesus for the burial. Seems to be out of place, doesn't it? Because that had happened about a week before that, or a few days, 6 days, I think. One of the confusing aspects of Matthew is that the Gospel of Matthew is not always in chronological order. And that can kind of throw you for a curveball. This section backs up to the day before Sunday of his triumphal entry. Remember that Palm Sunday. And we won't spend much time on this because we've actually discussed it before a little bit. But is there any thoughts or comment or any clarification you need on that? It's just the other accounts do not have that portion in this sequence of events. So, but I wanted to mention that because it is kind of confusing at times. We see in Matthew 26, 14 through 16, we see the betrayal plan begin to take shape, right? Look what it says. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you? And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So from that time, he sought an opportunity to betray him. The other gospel accounts in Mark 14, 10, 11 pretty much say the same thing. They were glad. In Mark 14, it says in verse 11, they were glad when they heard this and promised to give him money. So maybe, possibly, the 30 pieces of silver was just a down payment. Could have been. But we know that he never got any more. We know that for a fact. And then in Luke 22, 3 through 6, and Satan entered into Judas, who was called Iscariot, belonging to the number of the 12. And he went away and discussed with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them. They were glad and agreed to give him money. So he consented and began seeking a good opportunity to betray him to them apart from the crowd. I got just a couple of minutes. That's okay because we're going to carry over into. There's a lot here, yeah. think about the Sanhedrin's dilemma. How are we going to do this? And how it was resolved so easily with Judas. I, I mean, they could have never have anticipated that one of Jesus' apostles would show up. And we know it wasn't out of civic duty. You know, we're going to talk about Judas's maybe excuses, and we know that because it says, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him? How much money am I going to make?" Any comments before we stop for this evening? Yeah, yeah. I think yeah, it was. All falls into place. I mean, when you think about the 30 pieces of silver, okay, that was prophesied in Zechariah 11 and 12. You know, long before Christ was born. Pretty amazing. Well, we'll pick up on Sunday with the last part of lesson 102, and then we'll start in 105 and continue to go and finish up. Then we have questions to answer and all that. But thank you so much. Great class.